All right, welcome everyone to the Education Edit. This is episode 4. We are here with Patty Kelly and Tim Brennan. We are going to talk a little bit about math discourse today, and I'm sure that conversation will kind of blend into some other things. Patty, you're looking at me and like you've got something up your sleeve.
No, I'm just laughing because my dog now, of course, came trotting in and started whining and whatever. So if you start hearing some funny noises in the background, he's just being a fool.
Well, and
He's
I think he heard math discourse and wants to talk about it.
Probably.
that
Yeah.
was that's
That was what you
exactly
were
what I was going to say. Yeah.
saying. Tim and I, we share some thoughts. So we're going to talk about math discourse, right? I'm really excited about this because I love being in the literacy and ELA kind of world. Maybe predominantly or initially predominantly, it's always so interesting to think about like dialogue and talking and speaking and listening, but not just in like, oh, English class or ELA or literacy, but like that literacy, there's math literacy, there's all this stuff. So Patty, you're the pro. You're going to talk to us about this. I want to mention that we are supported by Partnerships for Literacy and Learning, which is a nonprofit literacy organization in Vermont, which is super awesome and helps to support implementation of literacy, actually, and math. And especially MTSS, which helps all of those things and helps schools function and improves student outcomes when done with a little support and a little help. We are also supported by the Vermont AOE, Agency of Education, and the what we affectionately call the SPDG project, which is the Specialized Professional Development Grant, is what that stands for. So, Patty, kick us off. What's going on?
All right. Hi, everyone. I am Patty Kelly. I'm currently the district math coordinator for Mountain View Supervisory Union. But I also work with PLL and do some coaching in districts and these types of webinars. So today we're talking about math conversations that count, building understanding through discourse. While my background is primarily math, like Audrey said, this discourse, the importance of conversations with our students and having them have opportunities to explain their reasoning about things and have opportunities to collaborate with each other. It's cross content. So hopefully this relates to any subject that you're teaching or working with students in.
I love that.
So 2 big ideas that are going to flow through everything I'm sharing today are initially the humanness of discourse. This really is about students being in environments where they feel comfortable and safe and have opportunities to share ideas and thinking with one another. And so much of this is about classroom culture and climate and how you build relationships with students. And so it's something that is just really critically important to me about making sure that we're all aware of our language and the affect that we bring to the table when we're supporting students in the classroom and with discourse. And I found this quote from the National Center of Education Research about the fact that 87% of public schools reported that the COVID-19 pandemic has negatively impacted student social emotional development. Something, unfortunately, I think anyone who's in education already knows. We've seen this and felt it. And while the pandemic was now a few years ago, our students are still growing through the system and having had that experience as kids in different grade levels. We're still seeing that and that it feels different, seems different than before the pandemic in our classroom. And so I think we have to spend a little more time and attention on making sure that we're developing those skills and the comfort in a classroom environment for students.
Patty, can I say, I feel like it's been interesting. I've been doing some observations lately, both in like kinder classrooms and some elementary settings, but then I also am teaching undergrads in a teacher prep program, right? And it's so fascinating to see some of the differences with the kinders and the kiddos that really were not either, I guess they would have been maybe just alive at that point. And they're, just the teachers reporting some differences in a positive way, but then also seeing, you know, my students in their late teens, 20s, 21, still seeming like this is so pertinent. Like this topic, I feel so pertinent to me because this is something that I see feels like a challenge. And Tim, I've talked to you a little bit about it because I'd come back from class or something and be like, oh, like I was trying to get them to talk to one another. I was really trying to build this environment, and it felt really like more challenging than usual.
Right.
And not that it's something I was like, it just felt like something that really needed to be cultivated, and that there was some challenge there. So it's interesting to see like the dynamics in the different age groups now as that
Right.
COVID wave kind of moves through. Um,
True.
so
Yeah.
that was just, I just
Yeah.
think it was interesting on sort of the like post, you know, K-12. Um,
Yeah,
Absolutely.
can I add a piece to that?
Absolutely.
For a couple of years now, I've been thinking, oh, because of the, the wisdom of separating at that time and breaking the medical condition cycle, right? And that all had some obvious medical benefit, right? Public health benefit. But it definitely impacted social emotional growth for students because they were isolated at a critical time when they shouldn't have been in a sense, right? So I kept thinking, all right, kids are going to be 2 years behind, or that's at least what it felt like in the classroom. My 10th graders were acting like eighth graders and so on. And I thought, well, this is going to take a while for this just kind of like push through. But eventually, it'll all kind of settle. Um, and kids will catch up, right? I think I think that for the kids who missed that time in school, they kind of developed some coping mechanisms and some strategies and just some habits that may take a much longer time to break. And I think the catch up time could really be measured in like decades. You
mm.
know, I don't. I'm just that's just a
Right.
that's not a data point. That's just kind of a speculation. Like it feels like kids may have like just become really different and like kind of altering that and bringing them back to some pre-COVID norms and expectations may take a really long time.
Well, and I
Not for
think
the
that's like the humanness part, right? Which I love that you're using this word, Patty, because like the idea of humanness is that it encapsulates like all of us humans, right? Like, and we've all been through different things. So this, you know, group that's moving through, not maybe, well, definitely, we all need grace, but like this idea of, you know, being attentive to that. So, anyways, I know you've got questions, you've got
Right.
things, Patty, but I really like
Yeah.
the phrasing of humanness.
Although I'm realizing I may not have spelled that correctly because I think that's humaneness. But anyway, I'll
But
have
it
to look that
doesn't,
one.
I like it that way. This
I'll
podcast.
check on that one. However,
We
my
don't
like
try to be
big
perfect here, Patty.
I mean, it just is. But I will say, for any educator who's struggling with this aspect in their classroom is, as I really believe the math practices are my rules for life. One of them is around perseverance and just, persevere, continue, and provide those opportunities. I had a conversation with a kindergarten teacher recently who was anxious about doing some discourse aspects in her classroom, given the dynamics of the room and the age of the kiddos. And, I just was really encouraging her, like, start small. And here's some prompts. Here's from some activities similar to what I'll be sharing today. And, repeated reasoning, continue to do the same activity multiple times a week over several weeks. Kids build habits, kids will build their capacity here, but keep at it because it's worth it. It really is. Um, so we're going to move on. The second piece I really wanted to make sure comes out throughout the conversation is, while there's this human aspect of the social emotional piece in your classroom, there's no doubt that what you bring to that conversation, how you design the conversation, the structure that you put in place, the questions you ask, those are going to vastly impact the success of the discourse in your classroom. So do not underestimate your own impact in that, and your own need to be really thoughtful in how you design discourse and how you design it in a way that's progressively complex for students that really meets where they are. So I think that's really an important thing. And I love Dan Meyer's quote. He says, if you want students to learn how to communicate mathematically, I need to ask them to communicate. You have to set up the system and make it happen, set time for it, and for it to happen. It's not necessarily going to just happen on its own. So with that in mind, I wanted to go ahead and do just a fun little activity, because this is something that, I think students, depending on how they're coming to the table, social, emotionally, or with their own feelings about the content that you're working in, discourse is a place where they will often shut down or resist or be like have struggle, because it feels like they're putting themselves right out there, right? So I really like to not only start with some fun, easy activities that are not content specific, but also like bring those back in over the course of the year. And this is across grade levels, right? Like we need to do these kinds of things across all grade levels. And the discourse should always be that low floor, high ceiling, like really accessible opportunities. But let's just start with a fun one. Really common activity in math is having an opportunity for students to look at same and different. So you can do this with numbers, geometric shapes, graphs, there's a huge variety of resources out there to have some ideas, but today's is not math specific. And here's our same and different. So 2 dogs in a photo for those only listening. And so Audrey and Tim, please feel free. What do you notice? What's the same? What's different?
They're both dogs.
They're both cute. I like them. They're both cute.
The coloration looks really similar.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I would say they both have noses and eyes. Getting really detailed.
It's a little tricky to see his eyes.
Yes.
Fluffy.
Yes.
So different, one's pretty shaggy, one's pretty shorn.
Oh, wait, that's a difference. Never mind.
Yeah, sorry.
No, I was
same or different, whatever.
Oh, we can do different.
Go for it.
One's inside, one's outside.
One's inside, one's outside.
They have different tags.
Audrey, what's telling you that one's inside and one's outside?
Great question, Patty. What's telling me that is the grass versus the hardwood floor. They both have collars on, evidenced by the tag that is dangling down.
But a different tag, it seems.
Oh, or is it a different angle, Tim?
Oh, well, I'm seeing what looks like a green tag on the left and what looks like maybe like a black tag hanging from a red collar on the other one. But maybe that's just a spot. I don't know.
So like I could go down a rabbit hole here, because like as I was talking about the collar thing with the tag, and like Tim, you're like, oh, is it the same color? I'm also like, technically, if we can't see the collar on the shaggy dog, is the collar there?
The green could just be
tied into the fur. Now that's not probable. That's not likely. Which, Patty, I feel like that was a math word that I just used. That's not probable.
Good job.
Can I also just break in real quick and tell you that I got to use the word subitize like 3 times this week, because it was just like part of a lesson, and I just love that word.
Don't you? It's and the act, like subitizing as a concept is just so.
It is, and I was like, I didn't know there was a word for looking at things and saying that's 3.
So cool.
I know. Okay, sorry.
I'm proud of you, Audrey. Good job. You're crossing over the math world.
I like
You're coming to my side. All
So
right. So any
is
other
it,
scene differences? Go,
I,
Tim.
I have a speculation.
All right.
May I?
Go for it.
I think it's the same dog.
Hmm.
I think it's a before and after picture.
Interesting.
I support that speculation. But
Well, obviously you have a bit of like prior knowledge that's coming into this
but I
one.
love playing games, and even if I know the answer, I don't want to ruin it.
There. So I will say, great work, Tim. What now, was it the same, all those same aspects that led you to the conclusion, Tim, that it was potentially the same dog?
I think that I think so. They seem like they're roughly the same size. They seem like they're probably the same breed. And then the coloration piece just felt like that kind of modeled, black and white piece is pretty random. And for them to kind of match up so well at the ears and you know, on the right shoulder and down the right side seemed unlikely to me. So I just thought maybe it was the same because of that.
So you are correct, Tim. Nice work. They are the same dog. Pre-haircut, post-haircut. Hard to believe, but yeah, that is my sweet dog Kirby, who's currently.
And if we can read into their facial expressions, it looks like he's not happy about the haircut.
He a little embarrassed, and unfortunately, this haircut also included some unfortunate shaving of his tail that added a new layer of like awkwardness to his look. So that he was not happy with me at all.
We've all
But
been there.
Does he get like a feeling of freedom? Like we have a much smaller dog that does this same trick, right? One minute it's just this little cotton ball, and then the next minute they're sort of angular and bony. But and we've tried a lot of different hairstyles, but the dog just pounce like it's a sense of freedom when all that fur is gone.
I do think he gets the zoomies for sure. I think he
definitely
gets this feeling of he can feel the wind on his skin and gets all excited. But as you can see from an activity like this, not only was it like kind of goofy and fun, but making those observations, thinking critically, debating between the two of you about the collar, like that was building that math practice around argumentation and critiquing the reasoning of others, right? Like you're building practices of math understanding and learning that you don't even realize you're doing in the context of something that's like pictures of dogs, right? And you can imagine that were this a math problem, I had put two examples of something, equations or whatever it might be, the amount of math vocabulary that comes into that then is amazing. It's a really great opportunity for kids to just practice that language that we're using and use it in context and talk to each other and make it part of that conversational aspect of learning. And so a same and different is like fairly easy to prep, right? Like that's the other piece about math discourse is that once you have some general like structures in place that I'll share today, I have a number of them, and primary questioning, the idea of like prepping things that are relevant become pretty easy, and you start even finding them and seeing the opportunities for them and things you're doing. I've seen teachers out, on the nature walk with their kids, and the kids had collected pine cones, and they take pictures of two different piles of pine cones, and then they come back into the classroom and they put them up and start talking about same and different or whatever it might be. Go for it, Audrey.
Yeah, I was like, now I have so many questions. One, I love the idea of that, just kind of continuing on into just like a kind of a routine and like just an embedded practice that isn't huge. And also the idea that I imagine just like students, just if they've had enough exposure to this sort of framing and this setup, that critical thinking just starts to like apply, as you're saying, to all these other things. So not only are they maybe seeing it in other classes, but they're just starting to kind of look at two things and say, oh, what are the how are these details different? How are they the same? Like, what does that mean, or what's likely to be there? Like, it's not likely that the color or the tag is floating, right, or tied into the
Right.
hair, right? But why, is it impossible? you know so my question actually was, and you may forgive me if you're going to talk about this later, but the idea of like, what's the metacognitive piece here? Like, when you're showing this kind of intro, which I absolutely love, and I actually think would be good for like literally any discipline. Like, I could totally see this in an ELA classroom, about just like learning, like trying to pick out details and critical thinking. And Tim, I can see you probably immediately with a science example. In fact, it reminds me a little of the small grain size, deeper learning ideas that we often talk about. Um, my like Do you set this up for students? Like, do you say to them like, this is for your critical thinking? Like how do they know what they're knowing in the moment? Tell me.
I don't know that I would set it up in that way, because I think that saying it in that way might set this expectation that might feel scary for them, or if they don't fully understand what that feels like or looks like or sounds like, they don't know if they can like achieve that thing that you're saying. If I tell them we're gonna really do this so that we can work on our argumentation and critiquing the reasoning of others, a second grader might have absolutely no clue what that means and be like, oh my God, I can't say anything because I have no idea what argumentation is, right? And I would worry it would kind of shut them down. However, after a conversation like this, I certainly would say, oh, like we have this math practice, and one of them is about being able to like defend your thinking and maybe ask more questions about someone else if you don't understand what they're thinking about. And let's go back to what Tim and Audrey were saying about the caller, and like that, were they asking each other more questions and like trying to figure it out together and understand each other better? And that would be an example of that. And
Well, and I
I
could assume
would
too,
frame it in that way.
yeah, like also like asking maybe what was going on for you inside? Like, how are you, like, what was your brain doing while you were doing? So I love how you said that, Patty, of like, let's not take the joy out of this by being like, you're going to present an argument right now about these two dogs who are really, and then having the stress and sort of the anxiety around having to do it in a way that is not perfect necessarily, but fits a certain. But I just really, I like that a lot. And then and I think the after, like really debriefing and like what's going on, and why, and it was great.
And there's been, a lot of debate over the years about being really transparent about lesson objectives, right? And we've had this conversation with math specifically because there's the fear of taking away that discovery aspect of what it is they're intended to discover throughout a lesson. And so I think I could probably go on both sides of that fence for different reasons at different times. And this is an example of where, like, I wouldn't want to necessarily put that high language out there at the beginning for fear of like shutting down what students might try or get into or naturally like have a conversation about. But at the same time, if somebody asks, why are we doing this? Well, we want to just practice talking to each other and have some time together to talk and listen. And, and that is still getting at the argumentation and critiquing, but it's just being like cognizant of what level is going to really reach the right end game. So I'm going to move on. So the objectives of what I really wanted to talk about today was initially to understand the role of math discourse in fostering that reasoning, problem solving, collaboration in the classroom, understanding some evidence-based strategies that promote this conversation. And we're practicing implementing some of those strategies. So that was just an example of that, what that would look like in our classrooms. So in terms of math, or in terms of discourse, it refers to the words, conversations, verbal tools that classrooms have in place to support students thinking about math, communication, and problem solving in math classrooms. That was the quote from Van Dyne. And I think I also will say at this time that another critical piece is that math vocabulary. So I think a lot about like a numeracy triangle when we talk in math a lot in the younger grades about a numeracy triangle, and it's really connecting that like visual uh, representation of number in a written form and the language, and really having opportunities to connect all those aspects of understanding quantity or number or whatever it might be. And similar to that with discourse, it's a real opportunity to connect. What students are seeing visually. Like you want to make sure you have like a math word wall or have those key vocabulary words that you're hoping students can bring out during that conversation, have them visible in the room and that you can guide students to them. And it's okay to say to them, okay, like we're going to do this activity. I want you to see if you can use some of those words like that we have up here and put them in context. Can we make that part of this conversation? And just making sure that you have a few different avenues for students to access that language. Sentence prompts, different questioning, and I'll have some examples here.
Can you tell us what a sentence prompt is?
So it would be a prompt where you're guiding them in what they could say with sort of a blank in it. So I'm noticing that the dog looks like they're blank. Do you think they're
like their collar, like their tag
right.
is floating?
Right. And sort of guide them and then ask them to repeat those sentences with filling in what their understanding is. So, and again, I have some examples coming up here.
Patty,
But
I feel like I'm going to connect this to Tim a little bit. I feel like the tier 3 vocabulary piece, the idea of like putting that out and like, not, I mean, I don't want to say expectation as in like this, really intense thing, but like putting it out and having it floating around. And when I say tier 3 vocabulary, for anyone who's like not familiar with like that high level vocabulary that really relies on context to understand it. And it is really the difference in the way that like students can communicate, right? So if you're a student who, well, there's a lot of factors in this, difficulty learning to read, those kind of things. If you're a student that's not having enough time to practice, like how will you adopt that into your language and even outside of the math context, right? Like we were just talking about the word subitize. Like I often kind of think of that as a similar process in the way that kids learn to read and that sound symbol awareness when they look at a word and they can scoop, like they understand it, like they can lift it right off the page. It in some way is that relationship. So the more that they're able to talk in this tier 3 language that is maybe kind of specific or contextually specific to mathematics, it's also just opening up this avenue for them to go into Mr. Brennan's classroom, Tim, and talk, and really bring that language forward, especially when they're trying to explain something. Like now they have all this facility if they've been practicing. I don't know, Tim, what your thoughts were on that, but.
No, I think that's a very real piece, particularly the movement from the math classroom into the science classroom, where often we're looking at data or we're looking at a graph or something, and sort of trying to draw some inferences from that. And so, if students come in from their math classroom with a stronger vocabulary, to build on and more ideas to build on, they'll make more sense more quickly of what's happening in the science classroom.
Absolutely. And having practice using the language is a big piece of it, but also that opportunity to hear the language from other people. We want to put the learning and the action of learning in the students' hands. So I love that discourse brings that to the students where they're now sharing their thinking and their language and their words with their peers. And I think there's a lot to be said for that.
I think it breaks down. I'm going to go into my kind of like social justice zone too, like the active exposure and teaching of complex thinking and practicing the language that mathematicians use, that scientists use, that even we think of that like vocabulary and a discourse a lot in like ELA classrooms and things, but I feel as though sometimes it's not even in that context where it's kind of expected, it's not explained or necessarily like framed in a way that students kind of know what they're doing or feel like, we give, I see this practice a lot less now, but like giving the list of vocabulary words that you memorize and then maybe you put them into sentences, maybe you read, but really just like practicing how to talk like this and showing that it doesn't just come. Like it's not just like some folks are born with this set of this sort of lexicon of words, right? And then others are not. And it really depends, this is really important instruction and it needs to be explicit in order to be equitable, if that makes some sense. I don't know,
Absolutely. So my prompting question here just is for both of you. How comfortable are you with facilitating discourse in your classroom?
This is something that I've worked on for a long time and felt like it was sort of one of the most critical pieces in a classroom is to get students to actually express their thinking, not for a grade, not for anything other than to just keep the ideas flowing and to turn off the expectation that I will deliver and you will receive, right? Just, hey, let's us talk this through. What do you see? What do you notice? Any of these kinds of prompts that you've been sort of suggesting and sharing already, plus 1,000 others, right? Just to hear what students are thinking, and so from a goals perspective, I feel like, yes, I am there. I value it. I want that to happen. And from an implementation perspective, I feel like over a period of time, I've developed some techniques for keeping the conversation going. I think the most challenging thing, and I'm sure we all have our most challenging pieces, but for me, the most challenging piece often is a student will unload. Just, I've got 12 ideas, right? And A, awesome, great that you've got these ideas. B, loving that you want to share. C, you're taking up a lot of space, like I am right now. And D, other students might be sort of like losing the thread because it's just too much. So I think for me, that moment is most challenging, and I don't know how to jump in, pause it for a second so we can unpack a little bit without being, perceived as rude or shutting down or whatever. Because I want every kid in the room to feel like we're going to hear what you have to say.
Tim, I think we all know I relate with that very much. I'm that kid. I'm the one that's like gonna unload like 12 ideas and most of them connect, but really but in all seriousness, I think it's such an interesting thing to think about how verbal processing is so important to some kids. However, how do we support? So you've got your ADHDers, you've got your neurodivergent students, your students who just need to hear themselves talk in order to make sense of something, but they also need to understand how to exist in a conversational space, a space of dialogue without dominating, without making so many connections that the point gets lost, right? And one of the metaphors that I think I've heard a lot that helps, I think, with students who tend to unload a little bit and take up that space is like, independently you can talk to them about, or the whole class, like I think not rules of dialogue, that sounds very intense, but like how to engage, right? So the metaphor that's always, I think, been a helpful resource is this idea of like a tennis match, right? Like are you in your conversation, in your sharing of ideas, are you able to like hit the ball back? Are you able to like receive the serve, right? Versus necessarily just like winging it out into the strong arming it past the fence, and it ends up in the pucker brush somewhere and we all have to figure out how to put everything back together, which is probably what I'm doing right now. But I think that that's like, there's a twofer there. You can't just verbal process to, or teach that that's, you don't, but I get the idea of like, you don't want to stop somebody from getting to an idea. And the
Exactly.
quickest way to shut down a kid who's, struggling is to be like, okay, stop talking, like too much,
Right.
too much. They'll never talk again. Right.
Yep.
So, but
And I have a few strategies for that I'll share now.
yeah.
And another piece of this is often that discourse component of a lesson might be like at the beginning of a lesson to sort of launch the content or the idea for the day, or it might be at the end as a sort of metacognitive, wrapping things up and coming together. And both of those time periods are, have limited time. You don't want to be spending, you don't necessarily have half an hour to have those deeper discussions. And when you have a class of potentially 20 plus students, that can be a challenge because is everybody being heard, or are you even having that opportunity? I think what's important to think about is, as the facilitator of that, one thing that could be helpful is developing some norms in
Mm-hmm.
your classroom. And, I often, even in my professional learning opportunities, we'll have some norms established. And one of my favorites is step up and step back.
Mm-hmm.
Like, step up and be present and be part of the group and make sure that you're contributing, but also recognize when you need to, like, you're going to give someone else a turn, and a student might not contribute every day for every moment, but you want to be sort of cognizant of who have I not heard from this week, you know, in the last few days. Like, it's okay if in a single moment or a single 15-minute period that child didn't have something specific for that day. Um, but just sort of recognizing that, or the one who is the super talker, like, say, right, like that amazing, like we're gonna give some other people a chance, or I'm gonna give you some examples of some activities that you can do that allow like more of that opportunities to respond, because that is important. We do want to make sure that we have a lot of opportunities to respond, that all students are engaging, that we're really keeping the train moving forward as much as possible.
And building on each other. I think that, going back to our original conversation about possibly certain groups of students moving through that life timeline having a harder time engaging. And I my hope is that they have the opportunity in their future profession and work to learn to build on each other. That it's sort of like, I'm sure we've all been a part of a class where people are sharing, but they're just like, they're sharing their thought. And then the next person shares their thought. And then the person after that shares their thought. And it feels very different than discourse. It feels very different than a conversation. Almost a little like I don't know why I keep saying you can feel it, but it just feels a little like,
It does. Well, I feel like it feels less human.
in less community. Yeah. Like
It's less about that humanness of us engaging together and that collaborative, collective efficacy of our learning. But yeah, I agree. I agree. So some of the research evidence, there's a lot supporting discourse. I just put some points together here for this, but really about a deepening understanding by encouraging that reasoning, those connections that students are making, helps build that classroom culture so that everyone can learn from each other's perspectives and notice new things and hear new language and think about things in a different way. It's really critical. And that we have that student-centered discourse, that it's about them problem solving, the critical thinking, those real like math practice aspects of logical reasoning, and like chewing on problems, chewing on new understandings from each other. Um, it's really important, and it really helps support that. Um, so we talked a little bit about this, but what barriers do you face in getting students to engage in those math conversations or any content conversations? Do either of you have any strategies that you'd like to share in maybe the student who is more resistant to being part of the conversation?
I want to bring up a quote that Audrey made a year or two ago that just like floored me because I didn't see it coming, and I think it made a lot of sense, and it gets to this idea of barriers. We were talking about, you know, opening up conversations in the classroom or having conversations in classroom discourse, and she said we really believe that like discourse opens up the learning, but sometimes discourse can shut down the learning. And I think, and I'm kind of paraphrasing, I think here, but I think what you meant, Audrey, was that if students aren't ready to share, or if they're anxious about sharing, then kind of an anxiety can set in, and then that becomes the thing they're managing as opposed to thinking about the prompt. And so they get shut down because, oh my God, I have to speak, you know.
Exactly.
So I think the that may be the barrier, right? Like that expectation of sharing publicly, right?
Mhm.
And maybe being wrong is terrifying, or at least anxiety producing for many people. And it can shut down the conversation and shut down the learning as opposed to opening it up.
I
Um,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, I was just going to say, I think one technique for like finessing that scenario is to do private reasoning time and then kind of a pair share. So, students can kind of test out an idea, and then you say, okay, let's open that up. And now they've rehearsed a little bit. They've heard somebody else say something similar, so they know they're sort of on the right track or whatever it might be. But I think it like kind of the slow release and the slow movement towards public sharing is one way to kind of get past that barrier of getting kids to engage in any kind of academic conversation.
Yeah, I love that. And I have like I think it's sorry if you can hear my pups barking in the background. The idea of pair sharing, the idea of like private reasoning time, I heard that from my math friends like a couple of years ago. And I was like, why don't we talk about that in ELA or English or like, that is like that is the thing. I also feel like one of the things that I've really tried to do when it comes to teaching vocabulary and context, or teaching, how to be in that kind of public space and speak about your, I'm going to say product, but that product could be your thinking, that could be your essay that you're working on, or the writing that you're working on, is to really get students comfortable with verbalizing their first draft thinking. So I can give two really quick examples. One, it was in my ninth grade English class. I had students, instead of doing this big presentation or talking about their writing, they were writing this was a couple of years ago, they were writing a 5-paragraph essay. Instead of having them talk through like their thesis and how everything was organized, I had them present while they were building their thesis, while they had a rough draft and they had some evidence, and to really talk it through with the class. Like we actually did a whole group, and there was this like really magical moment where a student was trying to talk through theirs, and they were kind of being jokey, but they were like, yeah, I don't really have anything. By the end of this, they said something like, I'd like to focus on Macbeth and darkness or something like that. And by the end of this, like the kids really stepped in to help this kid. They were like, hey, did you look at the second act where this is said? And next thing you know, he looks around and he like grabs a pad of paper and he starts jotting things down, because the other students are really supporting his learning, and like, yeah, you have a kernel of something there. Keep going with that language, keep talking. And I was really touched by that, because how other students can be, especially if they're put in a competitive space where they're like, I need to show my perfect thinking, I need to show my perfect. But if they're actually encouraged to not, and have a lower starting point and more of a beginner's mind, it it really helps. And the others are just like vocabulary, where we start with like, I'm like, which words in here are you unfamiliar with? And we would go through, and like they would actually like hold up like red, yellow, and green to signify like, and then you start to see other students who are like, yeah, I didn't know that word either, but they would have pretended that they did. And then that creates a culture of perfection. And then that
Mm-hmm.
brings us to a place of, I think, shutting down learning. And I think that maybe connects back to what Tim was talking about.
And I think it also brings up the idea of not just judgment, which is the sort of social anxiety that comes up, but if the if the contribution is thought to be in any way assessed by the teacher, if there's like in any way a grade associated with this conversation, the fear of being wrong, the fear of not being perfect can absolutely shut down the conversation. So I think it's essential that those conversations are part of the classroom culture that you're developing, and it's just natural, and we're not scoring this, we're actually just trying to understand and learn from one another, and like keeping that focus for students is huge.
And this is a community conversation, right? Like, not, I'm either the guide on the side or I'm the sage on the stage, right? Like the teacher's role in that is so important. Sorry, Patty, go ahead. This is such
and I was going to say, I think one of the fears, often in math and probably in all other subjects, is this idea that you're going to support or inadvertently sort of put out there misconception about an understanding of something, right? And that does happen, right? Where you have a student like put something out there that's like not correct, like it's just not correct, right? And this is where the sort of fluency and the culture of like the relationship with the student, your own bucket of resources in terms of some questioning, and I'm going to share a bunch of them in this slideshow, really come into play. And I think this is the barrier piece for me, is like making sure that I'm picking the right question, or really like in the moment, that quick thinking that sometimes has to happen to navigate, like to steer it back to, okay, let's look at this. Like you were saying this, and how do you like bring out the misconception? Because you don't want that just sitting out there like, oh yeah, good job, Johnny, like when everyone else is hearing that or seeing that. But at the same time, it is very much a place where you could shut down that kiddo like pretty poorly, right? Like it could be a situation where that really, I had a student teaching when I was a student teacher. I remember I went back to my own 5th grade teacher to student teach with her. She was amazing. And she would talk to me about crystallizing and paralyzing moments in your education. And that always stuck with me, clearly, 20 something years later. And I have those. I remember the moments in my own learning where I had paralyzing moments. And it was actually a public speaking moment of being put on the stage of like speaking in French, actually, because I went to school in Canada. And it was a paralyzing moment, and it impacted my ability to speak in front of people for years. And but I think about that, like a discourse does have that risk, right, of being that paralyzing moment or the crystallizing moment. We really want to make sure that we're setting up structures that make it that crystallizing moment for students in their learning.
Patty, I feel like I just had this moment of like realization when you were talking. This is basically like math therapy. I was just thinking about how you were talking about the paralysis and the crystallization, and how like I mean, this is no secret to either of you, right? Relatively introverted. And so people will be like, how do you talk to these districts? Or like, I mostly often work with leaders and, administrators, and I'm trying to bring these big things together. Right. But like, it's because I'm really, really passionate about the topics and I've leaned into, but ask me to step in front of or put a microphone in my face, and I am all blah. Like there is like it's such a weird feeling, and it's like in thinking about this, like, but in the area of whether it's EST, MTSS, ELA, literacy, that has been this space where I've been really lucky to just like be able to immerse myself in the language and the dialogue, and I just like will throw myself into these like areas of dialogue because I just want to learn from it, right? There's so much to learn. And so that's not paralyzing to me. But there's so much else. So it's just like that, like when we build that for students, when we really kind of build their ability to engage in dialogue in a context, right? And it might be math, it might be science, it might be, and then I think the importance of like seeing the connection across, like we were talking a little bit about before, but I just think that's so interesting.
So we're going to talk a little bit more about some talk moves and then some protocols in your classroom to help engage with that discourse. And so really it's about being prompts that elicify, they clarify, they extend student thinking, some general questioning from the facilitator, can you say more about that? Do you agree or disagree? Why? Can someone restate what they heard? For an example, like a store sells 4 apples for $1. How much would 10 apples cost? And have students reasoning about things. And how do they know? These are, pretty straightforward talk moves, but you want to have those like in your bucket, make them like a common practice, and even have like get to the point where kids are asking each other those questions, right? And those are the skills. Have them up on the wall. If you have like a list of prompting questions, put them up somewhere so that they can be referenced. And there are a number of protocols, like Tim was saying, opportunities for discourse that don't involve whole class, right? That they're not saying it in front of the whole group. Also, it increases the opportunities to respond, because if they're working with a smaller group, then there's more of them talking at once, and you can have more of that happening at once, which is really beneficial. You really do want to try to increase those opportunities. So the idea with the turn and talk, I'm sure a lot of people are familiar, but they turn to a partner to discuss a solution or some reasoning. And you want to make sure you have really clear prompts that they know exactly what they're talking about. You have some strategic pairing. You don't want them always turning to their best friend. You want some randomness to it in that way, but you also don't want to be facilitating like a situation where you have a student who's going to just talk over another student. You have to sort of frame some systems around that. Often in elementary grades, they'll have like a clock partner, or where kids' names are around the clock as their partnerships, or there's lots of different strategies out there for making partnerships, but having those explicit norms and expectations. So if you have like 4 or 5 different protocols you're doing, like you can have a little poster that's like, this is what we do when we're turning and talking. Like you're staying on topic, and you're, looking your partner in the eyes, and you're having a conversation, or, whatever those norms are. And having that safe classroom culture, thinking about your time management, making sure you're cognizant of that, because very quickly, once they've talked and said their thing, the rails fall off the train, and it's like off into what they're doing for the weekend, or what favorite sports team is playing, or whatever. And that monitoring and accountability, like you want to be walking around, you want to be listening, you want to be watching, be very cognizant as the educator that you're making sure you're hearing, listening for those misconceptions too, because the danger of the turn and talk is that if they're happening sort of in small groups and there's lots of them going around, and as an educator, you're not hearing it all, there may be some conversation going on that's like solidifying a misunderstanding that you don't want going down that road, So you really do need to be aware of the conversations that are going on, and be a good active listener yourself as an educator during that time. And then the turn and talks are always an opportunity to come back to the larger group and share out, but sometimes not. Sometimes that's okay. Go ahead, Audrey.
Sorry, I don't want to. I learned this from a math teacher years ago. In the turn and talk, like walking around and like recording things that kids say in their smaller conversations, and then sharing those out. And generally, it's positive. So if a student, they actually kind of get into it and they're talking about something and you kind of quote them, like you're just kind of like, I think this is a really amazing opportunity for formative assessment.
Absolutely.
If you have the time for it, obviously everything
Yep.
takes time. And I think I love all of these parts of it, and being able to record something down. And then also what you said about like a miscommunication, like sometimes they're more comfortable with their friends. So they're going to, or their group or their peers. So they're going to express that, or they're going to say it, and you can at least hear it and say, oh, I heard a couple of people say this and I want to clarify that and take the sting out of speaking and correcting
and outing someone to a larger group, right? Yeah. And I love the formative assessment component too. That's I was in a classroom a couple of weeks ago, and I walked around during a Turner talk, and all I was listening for was math vocabulary. That's all I wanted to hear. And so I went around and I wrote down every time I was hearing a student, and I didn't know these students, every time I heard a math vocabulary word, and I was writing them down. And then as they were finishing up, I started writing the words on the whiteboard and just drawing them to, as I was walking around, these are all the math vocabulary words that I just heard you using in your conversations. Like, how amazing is that you understand all these words that are specific to an idea in math? Like, great job, and it just helped like facilitate that. We want to promote that kind of work,
I think it's important for us to say that as we are using this phrase formative assessment, I would suggest we call it like lowercase f formative. It's in the purest sense of formative assessment, right? It's a teacher getting some thoughts and information about where their class is and adjusting instruction based on that, or making some kind of response based on that, as opposed to maybe a capitalized formative assessment. Here's a quiz or a homework assignment that I'm going to score, right? It's different, yes. Right? The other thing, Patty, about this turn and talk piece is it often can be used impromptu when you've asked the whole class, you've got some prompt on the board and you say, hey, like, what do you see about this? Or what kinds of strategies might we use? Whatever it is that you're leading in, and there's silence. And you use your wait time and there's still silence, right? Okay, turn and talk. I'll bet you have some ideas. Let's see what you've got with one another. And then they're more likely to maybe speculate with, even if it's a buddy, to just speculate and get some ideas going, and then say, okay, what do you got now? And then the conversation will be more free.
That's a great idea. I've been using that with my adult learners too. I will say a lot of these strategies and ideas are very relevant with adult learning environments too. I've been trying to work on my own wait time, and I've gotten to that like really uncomfortable moment of silence. And I've sort of been testing it for myself. And the number of times that you get to that like uncomfortable, like, ooh, this is awkward, and then someone starts to talk, I'm like, oh, like, no, and it engages another series of conversational pieces, and I'm like, oh, okay.
And even if they're just trying to break the silence, like somebody besides you, the instructor, the
right.
The guide is breaking through that wall and saying, fine, I will jump in. Or they're like, God, I've been negotiating in my head if I want to say this out loud, but nobody's really going. I guess this is my chance. Right. And sharing it. I love that.
Yeah. I think both the wait time and the turn and talk are messages to the classroom, like, I'm not going to be the only one speaking.
Absolutely. Yeah. So open-ended questions, making sure that we're posing questions that require an explanation, some reasoning, multiple paths for solutions. They're really going to promote that deeper thinking, the engagement. We want to make sure that we have that questioning in mind ahead of time with these prompts around like what's going to engage the conversation, so it's not just the answer's 3, and moving on. So things that would help, and I have a number of sections actually, and I wonder if maybe I don't read every piece because the slideshow will be on the Padlet available. But really, I have some prompting questions for your toolbox. And if you think about what your discourse topic is and it fits into one of these areas, I have a list of prompting questions that you could sort of have in your back pocket for that type of discourse. So, if you're problem solving or you're trying to reason through something, if you're trying to build a connection between ideas, I have some prompting questions. If it's an exploration or something creative that you're asking them to work through, or if it's reflecting on something, I have some prompting questions for that as well. So I'd encourage you to just like have them on a post-it note. If you know that that's the kind of thing you're doing, if you're doing like a metacognitive wrapping up at the end of a lesson and it's a reflecting, you're trying to prompt their reflection, things like what part of the problem was the easiest for you? What part was the hardest? What would you do differently if you were approaching this the next time? And what do you think is the most critical, important idea within this problem that you want to make sure is you share with your classmates or whatever it might be? So that's that little bit about open-ended questions. And if you're trying to deepen number sense, often there's number talks that we want to do in our classroom. I have a few questions around that as well.
Yeah.
Visuals and representations, using graphs, diagrams, models, encouraging students to see those patterns and connections. Again, kind of back to that numeracy triangle idea, like where we really want students to be connecting the verbal aspects of math and logical reasoning and whatever it is they're trying to work through with like visual representations of things and making those connections with what they see and how they can show it on a visually, making sure that that's available to them and that they're creating it or they're having access to them. So I have a little activity for us. We're going to do a little notice and wonder, very common practice in a math classroom. This happens to be actually a photo that I pulled off of Facebook from a friend who had put a set of golf balls into the Facebook marketplace to sell. And I was like, that looks like a math problem. And so I grabbed the photo and just thought it was funny. So for anyone who's just listening, it is a collection of golf balls that are in milk or egg carton. So I will throw it out to you, Audrey and Tim. What do you notice? What do you wonder?
Can I say that I noticed a feeling inside of me that yellow golf ball is very far away from the other yellow golf balls. Like there's yeah.
Can you describe that a little more for me or for anyone who might just be listening?
Like I thought like when you brought this up, because we're talking in the context of math, I was like, oh, this is some subitizing, see, there we go. Some sort of math thing. And then you just said it was just like they were selling golf balls. And I was like, well, okay. Not like, okay, like as in like this isn't, but I was like, oh, like I was fully prepared and trying to make sense of this as a math situation.
But it can be a math situation.
I think it is. I don't know which one, but that would be
so you're noticing that there's a yellow golf ball
kind of randomized, like it's out there in the egg, in a different egg carton than like the colors are like not really mixed up, and then that one is alone.
Is it alone in the carton?
No, there are other. I keep wanting to call them eggs.
They're golf balls.
I noticed that there are 4 cartons that are open, and then there's a bunch of cartons behind that are unopened. I noticed that there seems to be writing on I guess they are golf balls. I don't know if we're wondering yet, but before you told me that they were golf balls, they did not immediately look like eggs to me, and I wondered what they were.
Yeah. And that could have been something I could have left a little bit more open. I could have not given that clue initially.
I noticed there's only one green golf ball in the lower left-hand carton. And then there's like 5 red ones and 6 yellow ones in that one carton. And then, as Audrey has pointed out, the one isolated yellow one in one of the other cartons. And everything else is white.
I noticed that on that bottom row of the colored carton, that last orange, it almost looks red. It looks a little different than the other orange to me. Well, maybe that could be just my screen. But I also noticed that there are 12 spots in each of the cartons, and that the cartons that are open are all full of golf balls. All of those spots are taken up.
I'm really interested by this. And here, can I ask you a question? Even though I know I'm supposed to be doing this prompt, like my brain is going in so many, like I'm thinking about like student thinking in this moment, like metacognition, and I'm thinking like this is a very relatively simple picture, right? Like there's like 4 open egg cartons, there's some colors of golf balls, and there's some egg cartons in the back. I'm noticing a lot about my own thinking right now, in that I really want to categorize them. Like I have this compulsion to put them in order, or what I perceive as order, which is making me kind of like check in with this like bias around like organizing them. Like they need to be organized. And also I think I want to know the backstory. Like I'm a little distracted by my own thinking around like, did they stop wanting to golf? Like, or did they use these for something else? And it is a little like, I can see you laughing, but that is like, is there room for those kind of, because I could see some students being like, oh, I notice a lot, like, and having a hard time focusing in, but at the same time, maybe that's okay. But also there's something that, like you said, there's a clear pattern question here. Like, right. What do we do for our neurodivergent friends who go on a bird walk in their brain and forget the pattern part?
I think that, you can go in both directions. Again, it's a bit of the like knowing your students, knowing your community, knowing how much time you have. They can wonder those questions. I wonder, do they not like golf anymore? Like, I don't know. Maybe they're moving somewhere colder and there's not a lot of golfing. Who knows? Maybe you can talk about those things. But other times I have done this prompt and I've said specifically like what math questions or with, specific to numbers or patterns or whatever. Like I may prompt and narrow the prompt a little bit to make sure that we don't sway too far in that direction. But I also think one of the things that I really try to like talk to teachers about a lot is these prompts are cross content, right? There's a lot of cross content opportunities for these types of things. And, I remember looking at data recently with a group of teachers, and there was a social studies teacher in the group. One of the categories, the disaggregated categories where students were struggling was in measurement and data. And they said to me, well, I teach social studies. I really like this data means nothing to me. And we had a very good conversation about ways that data is very much socially relevant in context. And the New York Times has, pictures of the day and different, like they have tons of resources where you can go in and look for graphs that are related to social issues or there's just so many things available out there if you're looking for them or sort of have this like lens in mind that you can grab, and they're very much relevant to social pieces and wonderings. And so
and this seems like the foundation to that. Like if you can notice what's going on here on even a very basic level, if you can notice you're thinking about what's going on here, I'm verbal processing right now. And it reminds me of like when I was covering for a teacher and they were teaching The Great Gatsby. It's a beautiful novel, and some folks don't necessarily teach it a lot anymore. Some do. And I've always kind of felt like you have to have a reason in order to have a whole group read. And so I had a little facility around this. So we talked about wealth distribution. And that was a really great opportunity to bring up some data and some slides, but also engage with this really beautiful narrative text, meaning just the language itself, and things like that. So I really can see, and I could see crossover. I mean, not to make too much out of the golf balls, but like if you do have kids who are, really creative and wanting to like, is there a narrative that can go along with this and kind of blend that.
You write a story about why he's selling his golf balls.
I know. I'm already going to. It's going to be after the show.
There you go.
I'll report back next episode.
Absolutely. I mean, like, how fun is that? Like, sure, bring it into the writing component of the day later on. But and then of course, you mentioning categorizing the golf balls, lots of opportunities for prompting questions there, right? How would you categorize them? Why are you putting them in categories? Are you trying to count the total number? I wouldn't even ask, are you trying to count? I'd let you answer that question. What are you trying to find out about the golf balls? And so many number opportunities here too, right? Like the additive reasoning, the multiplicative reasoning. Some kids are going to count by twos. Some kids are going to count by sixes because they'll look at the top row, bottom row. Like some might count, but know that there's 12 in a box and count by 12s and assume that they're all full and count how many boxes. Like there's so many ways that the math is going to come out in that. And I think one of the roles from the facilitator in a activity like this, and this easily could be like a whole math class. You could spend a whole math class on this one picture. You don't necessarily want to, but one thing that the teacher can be doing is really writing down student thinking. You want to be recording student thinking in an activity like this because that's where some connections are going to get made, right? As someone is adding by twos or sixes, or they're multiplying, or whatever reasoning they are, you're going to start making those connections. Like, oh, look, you came up with, however many golf balls that are within these 4 containers, and you also came up with the same number, but look at the strategies they use that were different. How are they the same? How do they connect? Why are they the same? Like, there's so many mathematical aspects to that you then can bring together. And the recording of student thinking is really important there. You can also have students have a whiteboard at their place and have them showing their reasoning, building their representations or their thinking, and sharing that out so that they're making the recordings as well. There's lots of different ways to facilitate that, but you want to make that connection to their verbal processing and their thinking and like a written aspect for kids to be able to see and visualize.
I was thinking the visualization piece too, like if I've noticed some math practices where students are, they're drawing out, this was in subitizing, but like they were drawing circles to represent, the individual amount. And I was just looking at this. And then I was also thinking about patterns, like, and that I don't really see a pattern here, but like, wouldn't it be, but this could be the beginning of a repeating pattern. It could be, we could have students putting those colors into a pattern. There's like you said, like you could spend all day on this picture, which I think is really cool. And I like it.
And it literally came from Facebook Marketplace, friend who was selling golf balls. Like that's all it was. But because I have this lens now, I've been doing this long enough where I'm like, ooh, that looks like math talk. Like we could do this. And so, it becomes really fun. And I've actually seen classrooms where the teacher will task kids with finding images or things in the environment, things that I've seen like lined up snowballs at recess and kids wanting the teacher to take a photo of it so that we can have a math talk about it. Like the way that you can engage students in even the creation of the thing we're going to talk about is pretty awesome. So we're at, I remember us saying like, is this gonna be really long? And I'm like, no, I don't have too many slides. And, this is just one of those things, ironically, we can talk about forever. So another little piece that I have a slide about is facilitating those disagreements and justifications, encouraging students to be really respectfully challenging one another, constructive agreements. It really creates that critical thinking, problem solving skills. It's really tricky to get feedback. Even as adults, often we can struggle with having those conversations where we agree or disagree with one another. But having those prompting questions again, can you explain why it makes sense? Do you agree or disagree? Where is the strategy or the solution similar to what this person did, even if it was different? Um, so there's lots of opportunities for that as well. Specifically, and we've already talked about a number of these, but in terms of intervention strategies, students that may be struggling to be successful with this, you can scaffold with some close-ended questions as needed initially to give students a more narrower focus for what they need to be thinking about. You can revoice their responses to help build in that additional vocabulary or give them the language, modeling that vocabulary and context, offering those sentence starters, word banks, any way that you can provide that language, support that language with them. And again, I put these up as intervention strategies, but they're really just good classroom practices that ideally you're doing for all. But it will help support them specifically. Strive to try to build some discourse into each day that you're working with students, and provide those visual aids, the manipulatives, to help them show and demonstrate their thinking and record that student thinking. So those are all, pieces we had already really talked about, but a bit of a summary there. Another resource I'm sharing, you can find it in Principles to Action. So it's a little blurry there, but great math resource. But what it is it's a bit of a rubric around mathematical discourse. And it's nice because it can just be a good self-assessment of sort of where you are with what your role is during that time of the day, what your questioning is like, how you're providing that mathematical representations in the environment, and how the students are building their own responsibility to engage with it. So, I really like this rubric because it just helps me frame areas that I can grow as an educator. If I go through and think, okay, I think I'm doing really well with this, and this is maybe something I need to work on. So, it's kind of a nice tool to look at and think about.
I feel like you could use this in any, I mean, you could,
Absolutely.
it does say math specifically in some of the rubric squares. I really like this. And I could totally see this being a really helpful, especially with our teachers in training, and just a reminder for even, if you've been in the classroom for 25 years, just of hey, where am I on this? Am I really bringing out mathematical thinking? And not because I know we're at time, Patty, but I was thinking of, when you say manipulatives and things like that, I think sometimes of younger grade levels. But I know that probably isn't, it may be a term that's also used in the sort of middle high school area as well. But I think you mentioned this earlier, the idea of vertical surfaces, using whiteboards or, poster paper on walls where students are showing their thinking and have something to talk about and are standing up, engagement wise.
Yep.
So I don't know if that's something that you see in the older classrooms as more of a discourse strategy.
No, definitely in the younger classrooms as well, for sure. I think sometimes it's a bit of a classroom management situation, right? When you start moving kids to different areas of the room, especially, with the little ones who haven't developed those, sometimes the proximity matters if you can kind of keep them close. And not sway from that discourse focus of what you're trying to do. But I think just whatever, and again, it really depends on your environment, your classroom environment, what the spacing is like, and how you have those questions structured and what works for you. But I think that I've always really liked this rubric because it's just one of those things. There are many layers to it, and to engaging in discourse with students. And so having a focus area for yourself to really think about how to grow in that area. And I find this rubric just defines it a little bit and gives a bit of direction which is really nice. So I shared a few other additional resources. I also want to draw attention to there's a series of 8 mathematical language routines. I believe it was a study originally out of Stanford. So there's like a much larger document that sort of walks through it. Illustrative mathematics, Achieve the Core, like a number of really reputable organizations have packaged that document, and you'll see it on their websites as a resource. But they are 8 practices in the classroom that help facilitate language and vocabulary primarily. And sometimes they're sort of tagged as for intervention purposes, or students who might have English as a second language, but really, again, they're good classroom practices. And so it's another opportunity to look at some resources that support that discourse, give you some ideas about how to do it. I do want to just draw attention to a couple books, like some of my favorite resources that I think are just really great. So I mentioned Principles to Actions earlier. There's a whole section around discourse, but they also have a professional development module. So if you are an NCTM, National Council of Teachers in Mathematics member, then there is access to professional development modules that has some videos in there specific to discourse and talks about working through that rubric in the context of some videos. So if you're looking for like professional learning or something that you want to do with a PLC, there could be some really great conversations. They have some prompting questions around that as well. So that's one thing I just wanted to share. This is a very famous math series. There's number talks. There's ones for fractions, percents, decimals. I'm sure I'm missing ones out of the series, but they are really great. They also have a video series. I have the old school CD in this copy. That's exciting. I don't even think I have a CD access anymore. But yeah, so there's a number of math solutions books around classroom discussions. Again, like this one has multiple CDs in it. Need to find a CD, a DVD player.
I think CD players are going to come back, Patty.
Right, are they?
Well, Tim gave me a Bob Dylan CD for my birthday, and I bought a CD player just for it. So,
there you go. So yeah, so this one even has like a teacher's guide and a facilitator's guide. So if you're like in a professional development setting, or you're trying to facilitate some conversations around math discussions, this facilitator's guide has some additional resources around that. So that was what I wanted to share. I believe I put those. If I didn't put those references, it looks like I didn't put those all in the references section. I can certainly add them to the slide deck too, so that people remember what all those titles are.
Patty, can I ask you a question?
Absolutely.
What was the moment? Have you always just been like super into the idea of dialogue? Was there a moment in your like teaching career where you were like, wait a minute, like that is like really exciting to me? Because I can definitely hear the passion that you talk about this with.
So I think there's 2 pieces to it. One is when I was in the classroom setting, I really enjoyed just getting to know my kids. Like the building like a safe classroom community to me was really important. And I had some tricky kiddos over the years that would test my boundaries, as we all do. And I just was challenged by getting to know them and like building some way for them to like want to be in my room. Like that was my like challenge every year, is like, I want you to want to be here. Mm-hmm. And I really think that came with listening, being a listener to them and building that discourse. The other side of it was that for anyone in Vermont, you're probably familiar with the Vermont Math Initiative, a very famous math master's program that is just phenomenal and life-changing if anyone has a chance to engage in that. But as a math learner later on, after I had done a couple degrees and was in the teaching profession, and here I go into this master's program, and the way that they facilitated discourse and the way that they had us approaching problems in multiple ways and then explaining it and like making those connections across strategies and that was like life-changing in my brain. The aha moments that I had about understanding specific content, text and math, because of the way they did it. And it wasn't always these really high level math concepts. It was like some really like foundational pieces where just the way they asked the question hit the button right. And I was like, wow, like that matters. It matters how they sequence those questions, how they sequence those tasks over time, and having us talk it out and think about it and argue with a partner and all those pieces. Like, me as a learner was affected so much that I could see the potential for students in the classroom.
I love that. And I'm really like, the thing that's really sticking with me is like being a listener. And I wonder if for some, I think that still is hard work that I do. Like, in whether I'm in the classroom, whether I'm out of the classroom, but like the emphasis on like professional teachers really working on their listening. And I just think that is really important.
Absolutely.
Cool to hear you say that.
Yeah, I don't think there's a skill more important for being a teacher than being a super listener. Like if a student volunteers to share a thought, you better pay attention because there's something in that thought that's going to allow you to like connect to the content or connect to something else that some other student has said. And listening really carefully is such a valuable skill for a teacher, and it also models for your students like if somebody says something, pay attention,
Absolutely.
be connected.
Absolutely. That model for the group as a whole. That's a great point too.
So
So
we
thank
were,
you
yeah.
so much. I hope that was some new learning. I mean, I certainly didn't go through all the activities or protocols that you can do, but hopefully there's some nuggets in there that are
Patty,
helpful.
I'm feeling like a discourse part two. I don't know. I think this is really important, and I'd love to explore more about it. And I think I can see Tim's giving his universal sign for, yep, I'm in. And I think it would be really fun to keep talking about this in different contexts, because what I hear you saying is, and I'm capturing this from Tim, let kids talk and listen to them. And I think that's pretty powerful and something that I think always intend to do, but just having some really practical like strategies around that as a teacher, as an educator, I think is really important. So thanks, Patty. That was fantastic. Really enjoyed
Thank you. That was a lot of fun.
Yes, awesome. Thank you.
And I'm so proud of my dog right now that he made it through us
I'm
doing
proud
this
of the dog.
without being a pest. He has napped the entire time right next to me. What a good boy.
I'm less proud of my dogs.
And that is, in fact, the fluffy dog and shorn dog from the beginning of the slideshow, too.
Well, sorry, Patty, I didn't mean to. I was just going to say, we are at an hour and a half. I wanted to let folks know that there's an exit ticket that goes with this, where you can both give feedback and earn your time. So there's 2 hours of professional learning goes with each podcast. Even though the podcast is really only an hour and a half, we imagine that you're engaging with the resources and checking things out and spending a little bit more time on that. And the exit ticket is, of course, part of that. It's relatively simple and straightforward to answer. It's not, we don't like to, we work hard enough. We don't need too many hoops to jump through. But again, Patty, fantastic. So fun to have this conversation, and I think really productive. And I will see you guys all back at the next Podinar time.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.